I have, in the past, made comments that may lead you to believe I do not like Hearts of Iron 4. In the past, this was true. The game's bugs were, and are, infuriating, and its sandbox is shallow. When people call it a map painter, they're not far off from the typical mechanical experience of the game. Especially if you don't micro your units, the experience of playing the game can be as simple as picking a large country, building a large army, declaring war on someone, then hitting the attack button and letting your army spread your country's color automatically, with very little more to consider than that. The tech tree is generic, intelligence is half-baked, diplomacy basically doesn't exist, the civilian economy basically doesn't exist, and many mechanics that could serve to spice up the game are locked behind the game's mountain of DLC, most of which are at best questionable purchases given the lack of quality control. The shallowness is, however, deceptive, though it does require some effort on the player's part to negate. See, while HOI4 may be shallow as a sandbox experience, which is what strategy games are typically expected and designed to be, well, that or APM-weighted, tightly balanced, multiplayer-focused competitive experiences, HOI4 has several features that, with a modicum of player investment, turn the game into a narrative experience rather than a pure mechanical sandbox. The most obvious and important ingredient in making it so are focus trees, which are essentially decision trees that prescribe paths for a country to follow, choose your own adventure style. You can take foci in a somewhat non-linear order depending on how many foci get unlocked after a prior one finishes, but you will always end up at some predetermined endpoint, though which is up to you. From the perspective of a sandbox experience, focus trees come off as a lazy cop-out to compensate both for a lack of mechanics that would facilitate encouraging the player to take such a path, and for the AI being generally incompetent and thus needing to be railroaded into doing a pre-programmed list of actions to at all simulate history, or whatever alt history you allow it to act out. The criticism is valid from that perspective. Without focus trees, none of the real-world constraints that caused World War II to happen the way it did really exist in HOI4, and the player could gallivant off into world conquest fantasyland pretty much immediately. Likewise, the AI has always been neglected by Paradox, and can barely be wrangled into a facsimile of World War II by the focus trees as it is. In the absence of foci, they would either act totally ahistorically or, in many cases, do absolutely nothing whatsoever except build a military and wait for the player to show up and attack them at some point. However, what foci do, what makes them important to the experience, is that they directly narrativize the events that take place. Foci have text descriptions, discrete effects, and outside the generic focus tree are, most importantly, unique to that country. These make foci present themselves as instances in a story, the story of that country. The player doesn't have to entirely headcanon why their nation is doing something, since the focus name and description will usually justify why it is happening, though briefly. Importantly, again, it can also only happen in that country, which means you are embarking on a unique path, one only this country can follow, as if the country were itself a character and the player their mind, quite literally making the player the spirit of the nation. And while one could lament that this is a fascistic fantasy, the epitome of Mussolini's corporatism, it is also a logical position for the player to inhabit from both a gameplay and experiential perspective. While foci are the most critical component for creating the actual narrative path for your chosen country, as in the sequence of events that happen and why, they are far from the only thing that reinforce the game being less of a strategy sandbox and more of a military political narrative vehicle. National spirits are another, as like foci, they are country-specific and sometimes come with flavor text that describes the reason this country has this particular attribute. Like many, though not all, foci, national spirits often, but not always, have unique icons and names. If we return to the nation as character analogy, national spirits are akin to character traits. There's also decisions, which are lists of actions a country can take once the unlock criteria are met, and have a range of effects. In the base game, many of these are generic or underbaked and often lack any flavor text, so they're not as narratively defining as foci. but with better narrativization behind them, they can have a similar effect, which is especially apparent in some mods. As well, there are pop-up events, most of which are just used to announce events in the game's world or in your country, but can also be used as a decision-making system outside the focus tree, putting several options in front of you and making you pick one. In function, this is the same as the focus tree, but they are triggered by the game itself rather than explicit player input, have more room for a text description, as they have the full height of the screen to work with, and fill the middle of your screen, forcing you to pay attention to and deal with it, meaning they're well suited to modeling immediate matters as opposed to the pre-planning implied by a national focus. Finally, on top of the above, you have miscellaneous flavor bits like unique unit types, though those are rare, your country-specific cast of military commanders, and country-specific name lists for military units. The extent to which these mechanics actually create an engaging story to follow in the vanilla game is contingent on the age of the content you're playing. Paradox used a lot of samey, generic foci to start, with not much flavor text on anything, almost no decision pop-ups, and no decisions tab whatsoever. Even as more was added, it is only more recently, especially once they started hiring modders to make their content for them, that they've taken better advantage of what I've mentioned so far to really tell a story with a country. And this sadly means that countries that haven't been updated in years are much shallower, more mechanically focused experiences that take way more headcanon from the player to get any kind of narrative out of it. But as what I said before implies, where these mechanics shine is in mods, as it was modders, not Paradox, that first realized the potential the game had to be turned into, well, at the far end of the scale, a national-level visual novel with wargame elements. Now, I'm sure you're expecting me to talk about the New Order at this point now that I've said that, as it is arguably the current apotheosis of turning HOI4 into a visual novel, to the point some hate it precisely because of how much combat is de-emphasized. But I won't. Not because it isn't true, not because it doesn't exploit the game's tools to their fullest to tell a story through it, but purely because its off-brand Man in the High Castle setting just doesn't interest me very much, and as a result, I do not have much experience actually playing it. So I don't feel qualified to make my point using it as an example, even though it certainly deserves it. I have vastly more playtime in The Fire Rises, which takes a similar storytelling approach to TNO. One might rightly accuse it of copying TNO's homework, but to a lesser extent, with large wars still being the centerpieces of every path for every country. To give the devil his due, I'll concede TFR's narrative mistakes up front. Much of the mod's text is written by ESLs, and can on occasion devolve into complete incoherence. It doesn't help that the text itself can sometimes tackle subjects whoever was writing it didn't fully have a grasp on, like Logi's attempts at philosophizing at you. The level of narrativization is also inconsistent, sometimes wildly so. Some focus trees are riddled with foci that have no text descriptions, breaking the drip feed of context these normally provide, or, in the case of the National Socialist Movement, having almost no foci with descriptions at all. You can also compare the vast cognoscenti focus tree that gives the US plenty to do after reunification versus the bare-bones, unnarrativized, generic, post-war content the other factions get. There's also various bugs and oversights that can ruin immersion and prevent the story from playing out as it should, like the Great Asian War stalemating after China takes the continent because the AI can't organize naval landings to save its life, or the Second European War never happening because Europe is stuck in limbo due to not being able to deal with island holdouts resulting from the Spanish and Greek civil wars for the same reason. All that being said, so long as you don't pick a particularly undercooked or bugged path, though you're not wrong to be mad if you unknowingly do, TFR successfully utilizes HOI4's mechanics to tell a military political story for your chosen state, leaning on two pillars to work. The first is all the flavor elements, which are apparent right from the beginning. You'll notice that many foci have rather lengthy text descriptions laying out the rationale behind the action being taken. You will also find your country's info tab adorned with a long list of national spirits, almost all possessing unique icons and most also possessing lengthy text descriptions explaining why your country possesses these traits. Your economic system and ruling party's ideology will also be summarized, and if the devs care enough about them, your head of state will have a lengthy biographical text pop out. So right off the bat, this is all excellent for getting the player in a role-playing mood. the sense you are controlling a unique place with a unique culture, political system, historical context, and society is established immediately. If you take the time to poke around the map, this will be reinforced further. National monuments the devs deem worthy enough will appear as 3D models on the map, and cities the devs consider important will have unique pictures in the tile info tab as opposed to the generic terrain type pictures. Many will also have pop-up text descriptions if the player hovers over the picture, usually justifying the importance of the city, though occasionally not. Most notably, the short, satirical/contemptuous descriptions of Berlin and Paris make it rather obvious the Russians on the dev team are trying to instill you with contempt for France and Germany, even if you choose to play them, because naturally they're chauvinists and just can't help themselves, no matter how impartial they relentlessly insist they are. As well, if you open the music player, you'll find not only the mod's own soundtracks, it has two, but playlists of copywritten music themed around particular countries to give playing that country its own soundscape. Explanatory pop-ups will begin appearing once you unpause the game. The US, for instance, gets 2 huge walls of text immediately, while various world events will be announced in pop-ups just as in the vanilla game. But in addition, TFR also contains many low-level pop-ups as set dressing, showing snippets of individual lives to highlight the impacts of all the high-level actions the player is involved in on individual people, from an investor committing suicide after the Dow crashes to the impact on the day-to-day of the Rosgvardia of Russia's leadership change, among many other things. This is something the vanilla game does not do at all, which leaves the entire mood of the game very high-level, planning room-esque, the realm of important people making big moves. By contrast, TFR tries to make it much more evident to the player that what they're doing affects people's lives day to day, pulling them back down to street level from time to time so they don't forget that. Decisions will often be grouped into themed categories with flavor text describing why this category of decisions is important and what it accomplishes for the nation. The mod also makes heavy use of the balance of power mechanic added to Italy, well, and Ethiopia, but who cares about Ethiopia, in By Blood alone, with most paths for most countries using it to model competing political factions within the particular permutation of the state you've chosen. Even then, it can vary in import based on country. The centralization level of the APLA directly determines which faction ends up leading it, while China, being a one-party state with no real political opposition, merely uses it to represent the policy tilt of the Communist Party and whether it prioritizes economic growth or economic equality, with each path giving different stat modifiers. In pre-Civil War America, the bar is used to gauge the popularity of your chosen election candidate, Trump or Biden, which affects who wins, and thus what post-election pre-Civil War focus tree you get. Thus, even in universalizing a mechanic used only for a few countries in the vanilla game, the mod keeps it feeling particular to each country by having the bar's actual effects vary meaningfully by country and path. The aggregate effect of all these flavor elements, the foci, the decisions, the national spirits, the pop-ups, even the visual design of all these things, is that the mod conveys to the player the intent behind and the effects of the actions and policies of their chosen state and ideology pretty constantly, keeping the player in that ideologically driven headspace. Despite lacking more granular mechanics to tie these things directly into the gameplay, you're not going to have to, literally gather the resources and assign the assets to build, say, the MSS surveillance network or its secret labs. You just press a button. The game does tell you these things exist, they are happening, this is the kind of society you are creating by working your way through this focus tree and checking off these decisions. So it's not hard to headcanon what's going on in your country day to day, even if it isn't really modeled. And this also contextualizes the violence you engage in, since, after all, this is a war game where you fight wars. When you paint the map in your country's color, you're not just showing you're good at the combat, not that that's difficult since the AI is brain dead. You're spreading the control and effects of that state. You know that as your territory spreads, more of the planet is subjected to whatever your own population is subjected to, which you can, of course, view with glee, horror, curiosity, or anything in between, depending on your political persuasion. To be clear, the vanilla game can do this. Just really think about what you're doing when you do your next Nazi world conquest. Like, just think about that. But the vanilla game is not as rich in narrative flavor as many mods are, leaving things more vague, less vivid, and the impact of your actions on the world less stark, which is not helped by the fact Paradox is so terrified of being accused of enabling fascist fantasies despite still doing so and profiting from it, that they intentionally don't bring up a lot of the fucked up shit your actions are implicitly enabling. TFR has no such qualms. From the, Neo-Confucian purification zones to the world government's population culling to the Atomwaffen division nuking the entire planet, the effects of what you're doing are the opposite of vague. You may not know exactly what you're getting yourself into when you pick a given path through the mod, but once you have, oh boy, will you understand what it entails. So that's one pillar of TFR storytelling. Let's call it the vibe pillar, the ideological aesthetic pillar. It sets the tone, motivation, and characterization of your chosen country. The other pillar is the narrative structural pillar. Not the why, but the how. They share the what. The mod is able to make first-time runs of a given path novel and unexpected by hiding parts of the focus tree that have not yet been unlocked by various triggers. The result being that your focus tree is given to you in progressive chunks as the criteria to reveal new batches of foci are met. For instance, you cannot see the focus trees for each faction in the US Civil War from the beginning and plan your path through the tree beforehand like you can in vanilla, as you can only see the foci leading to the inauguration, not after it. Even then, you'll only have a pre-war focus tree revealed to you after inauguration, while you can only see your chosen faction's focus tree once the Civil War actually starts. This gives delving down each path a sense of intrigue, as you're never sure exactly what will happen to your country until you've chosen that path. While you're mechanically rewarded for planning for war, of course, in terms of your political trajectory, the mod forces you to jump in head first, to pick a path only on cursory information, so you feel excitement when you are finally shown what the results of that choice will be. You choose where to take your country as much to see new content you can't otherwise glimpse, what has been behind the curtain on your other runs, as you do for ideological or nationalist reasons. Even then, the process is multi-branched as any impressive tree should be. Once you've made a choice and been given a new focus set, there may be hidden foci you have yet to unlock, awaiting the outcomes of other decisions down the road. To go back to the US context, the fact all focus trees and thus the possible consequences of events are hidden beforehand means you have no idea what exactly is going to happen, only that there will be a civil war. It causes the countdown timer to have real narrative weight to it. You're getting constant pop-ups before that about violent uprisings, the country is stricken with crippling national spirits, the economy grinds to a halt, and yet all you have is a timer and perhaps a few contingencies planned from the small pre-war focus tree. There is no hint as to exactly what will happen, how it will break up, how many factions there will be, what units you'll inherit, what the sequence of events will even be once it starts, or what choices you'll be able to make to deal with it. You get nothing. There is no future roadmap. It is not like vanilla, where your end goal is visible from day one, and thus everything that happens along the way is, outside of unexpected pop-up events, part of the plan. There is no way to plan, because you're not informed what the situation or options available will be. The chips will fall where they may, and you just have to roll with it. It is arguably the most tense moment in the entire mod, because shit is about to go down, and you cannot really prepare for it. It's brilliant. Intrigue is not the only way the narrative structure of the mod draws players in, as it is not above using outright deception in ways a more sandbox experience like the vanilla game would never pull. Which is to say that, yes, the mod actually has plot twists. There's a minor case of this before the US Civil War. There's a trio of untakeable decisions in the Decisions tab that require you to stabilize the country before they can be unlocked, and a ledger of congressional support which would make one think they're going to be playing political games to win congressional support for various things. But this is all a lie. The US cannot be stabilized, and Congress is irrelevant, unable to do anything to change events. But you won't know that until inauguration, when the countdown to the Civil War begins, and the game explicitly states there is no escaping it. Before then, especially if you're used to vanilla, you expect that if content of some sort, foci, decisions, mini-games like Congress, exists, it exists for the player to, play with. Thus, you would naturally play on as if you could, if you play your cards right, prevent the collapse. It creates an expectant, perhaps even cautiously optimistic headspace for the player to slip into, deceiving them into thinking they can weasel the country out of this predicament. You can't, but the initial deception is still a good idea because the realization you can't stop it means a lot more, carries a much greater sense of loss if you've been operating on the assumption that if you just play your cards right, you can save it. But as I said, that is only a minor example. The big lie of TFR is Russia, which at first glance seems to be set up to follow a faithful reenactment of our actual timeline, with its focus tree timing out to end up leading to the invasion of Ukraine either right around or somewhat after the actual invasion date, depending on how many optional foci you take. This being a war game, with even the mod itself centered around a few huge wars, you will obviously spend your time preparing for this invasion, building up your military, especially since the collapse of America makes it seemingly an easy target. But then, a twist, yes, a plot twist. Mere months before the invasion, as you are working through the last few foci, Putin is killed by the deadlier coronavirus that has already thrown the timeline off from reality by killing King Salman. The player, busy preparing for the Ukraine invasion, assuming they were about to launch it, is suddenly thrust into having to decide who should take control of Russia on very short notice. You are slapped with complete mood whiplash, going from war planning while trying to suppress political opposition to now directly contending with and consider the merits and demerits of that opposition, while your military escapade is postponed indefinitely. Again, you won't be shown the focus tree for the path you must rather quickly choose until you've made it, meaning that, once again, you don't know for sure where you're heading as a country, which is exactly, I suspect, how most Russians would feel if such a situation came about, putting you quite literally in the national zeitgeist. It's also worth noting that, with the exception of the United States, due to most paths having anemic post-unification content, the story of each playable country, no matter the path you pick, actually follows a traditional 3-act story structure. Act 1 is the lead up to and settlement of a war with your regional enemy, Act 2 is dealing with the fallout of that, and Act 3 is fighting the even bigger rematch that decides the ultimate victor and the state of the planet. These, then, are the two pillars of TFR's storytelling. The intrigue and tension of not knowing how events will unfold, holding the player's attention and investment in the game's events, and the national flavor and aesthetic that put the player in their country's ideological headspace to give them the motivation to roleplay as that country, to always be aware of what their country is doing and why, and how their own actions could match that rationale. You get a vivid sense of what your country is, what it's doing, why it's doing it, and the impression this experience is unique and special, and that you, the player, are having a meaningful impact on the world by controlling and waging war on behalf of this country. You can sit back at the end of a TFR run, whether it's a new Russian empire stretching from Greenland to Chukotka, a Fourth Reich succeeding where the Third failed, or the AI overlord relieving the flesh bags of their control of the planet, and say, this country is powerful and important, and thus its ideological underpinnings have justified themselves, and the decisions you, the player, have made on its behalf have been vindicated. Thus, within this little game world, you, the player, by extension, are by implication very powerful, very skilled, and very important. You could say that's always the case in any game that enables a power fantasy, but the context is critical here. The power fantasy of HOI4 is power and glory and validation on a global scale, with the entire world forced to submit to and recognize your awesomeness. Is it any wonder it's Paradox's most popular game? Is it any wonder that the mods that enable this fantasy even more effectively than Paradox themselves are so beloved? I should well think not, nor should it be any mystery why people heavily driven by ideology or nationalism, especially if reality does not serve them well on those fronts, flock to this game to play out their national or ideological fantasies. Hell, I'm one of them! And regardless of the game's numerous design flaws and questionable character of both its developers and many of its modders, I love it for that, and am glad it exists, because, as I am wont to point out, Being able to indulge in these kind of fantasies is not something games commonly enable, and an experience being, to a good extent, unique can justify engaging with it regardless of other serious flaws it may have. I said as much when I reviewed Skyrim, and the same applies to HOI4.